storing malware stagers in enterprise services. All right, this is a very interesting topic, at least for me and possibly for you, which is why you're here. It's kind of the agenda we'll talk about, really kind of give some history, give some examples of actually putting this into use. We'll kind of wrap up with some other training, free training in this environment in which you can practice some skills, what have you. But as we start, this is me, right? Been with the DoD for about 18 years. Really enjoy what I do in that space. Technical director for a Cyber Operations Center. Very much in love with PowerShell. You'll kind of see that running throughout. But so much so that I like to develop tools in that space, whether it's blue team, red team, what have you, and then also like to kind of give back, right? Because you heard Dave talk about kind of how everybody gets a start. And I got my start because somebody took some time to kind of help me out, and I want to do that to somebody else as well. So as we start talking about this, we first kind of have to define malware, right? We're talking about stagers. Let's define malware first, right? This may be a TL, DR type thing, so we'll kind of sum it up. And essentially, we're talking about malicious software that's designed to infiltrate and do things to a machine without actual consent, right? And at the core, that's what malware looks to do. So where did it really all begin? Well, it began roughly about 1971 with a young man, Ben Thomas, who actually created the Creeper malware. And really, it wasn't developed to be malicious at the time. It was really, can I make this execute on another machine through some type of connection? So at the time, it was ARPANET, right? So before there was the actual internet itself. And again, it wasn't meant to be malicious in nature. And as such, the replication or how it propagated was really relied based upon human interaction. And then there was a time in which somebody looked to make it in a workable fashion in which it could replicate on its own. That's very minute when we look at where we're at today. And where we're at today, definitely more sophisticated than anything else, right? We have malware that's polymorphic. We have this whole cat and mouse game, right? You heard Dave talk about adding the carrot of sorts. So as somebody of malicious intent is developing malware, and as a defender is coming about and actually highlighting that malware and or coming up with tactics to defend against it, the malicious person is constantly looking for new ways to really go and get around them. So it's a cat-mouse game that consistently and is always going on. But at the core, now we're in a space in which this is almost like a business where people are backing individuals to develop said malware, whether it's through financial gain or whether it's through just the equipment itself. But you know, while we still have people who are lone rangers, if you will, when we got to the point of it being an organized crime and state-sponsored, it really started to change the game. And we see that running very rapid in this space today. Then when we look at the different types that are out there, now this isn't all inclusive, but just kind of some of the ones that are prevalent still today. I think viruses and worms, those kind of go without saying, but ransomware in this space, right? Really, really huge. It's getting to the point where people are infiltrating a machine, encrypting said files or folders or just data, period, and then they're holding them for ransom until somebody pays some fee. To never give those files back unless that fee is being paid. Rootkits have been a thing, continue to be a thing, very, very stealthy in nature, right? Actually highlighting them were really difficult for one to do. Trojans, keyloggers, adware were really grayware, but keyloggers definitely making a ramp up in this space as well. And then when we talk about really hiding our malware, or somebody trying to hide their malware rather, they have packers. So now they're trying to compress the actual true binary. Let's say it's some standalone, BG info or what have you. They're trying to compress that so they can allow their malware to be wrapped with it, and it will be self-contained. So upon execution, it starts to do its own self-extraction. We have people using encryptors, so that way, if the binary is found, whether it's an actual EXE or DLL, there's some type of form of encryption or XORing applied to it, so it's not as easily depictable. The whole polymorphic aspect, very stealthy in nature, makes it much more difficult for a defender to actually find it. Why? Because it is consistently changing its form or fashion from system or platform. And then we get to the point where we start talking about stagers, and really this is the basis for this actual talk. So stagers themselves, right? At the core of that, that's gonna allow us to learn a little bit about the machine before we bring in the actual real payload that we care about. And when we take a second to really define stagers, right, we're talking about something known as a dropper. Some people call them downloaders, right? Or initial vectors, if you will. But at the core, these are tiny in nature, pieces of code that get shipped or packaged with our initial payload. So maybe we have some exploit that's gonna be our initial access vector on a machine. Rather than bring the actual real payload in which we care about, not really understanding the state of the machine, whether AV is gonna pick it up, or maybe it's some good defender that's gonna be able to highlight our stuff, we'll first put something lightweight on there that's gonna allow us to protect our equities, the very thing that we maybe spent time, money, resources in developing. And then we essentially allow our stager to look around and figure out if the coast is clear. That's really, really great for us. But that stager is gonna allow the system to initiate some connection back to our C2 server or servers, right? Because when we look at outbound traffic, typically that goes a little bit more unnoticed than somebody actually trying to beacon into your machine. But at the core, it lessens our blow if our tool set is found, because again, this stager is gonna be very, very small. We'll look at a couple of examples here. And regardless of what malware we're using, it's gonna be expensive. We've either spent the time and money on buying it, or we spent the time and resources in actually developing it. So our delivery method kind of looks something like so. We have an actual machine, it gets exploited, the stager may be attached with it. This is just an example, it won't always be this case. We have that stager on the machine, that stager then initiates a communication or some type of traffic back to our C2 server or a subset of servers, right? Because we may have it to where it reaches out to a number of servers, so it's not static in nature each time. And then once it reaches out to that machine, that C2 server would have a second set of instructions. Maybe go survey the machine, or give me this type of data, or execute this next payload, or just go to sleep for a period of time and then reach back out to me later on. But at any rate, typically that next stage, if not that first stage, is gonna be encrypted. All right, you wanna be able to protect that data and that communication most as possible. But that second part is really where we look to see that malware. Whether it is a virus, whether it is a worm, rootkit, keylogger, or what have you, that's really where we start to see that being done. The common task, not all inclusive, but generally speaking, before somebody, maybe myself, invests a lot of time and effort into a machine, I want to know if that machine is clear. I want to know if what the state of the machine is some other active there. Maybe the exploit that I have, the follow-on payload, maybe it's not susceptible on that machine. So we would look to probably survey it a little bit. Some AVs are better than others, right? What is the state of the machine? What is the environment like? Depending on what that comes back as, then our next follow-on steps will be done accordingly. And in some cases, we may look to start terminating services in order to ensure our equities are taken care of. We will want to validate if we're in a virtual machine. Now, if the environment runs on nothing but virtualized infrastructure, then this is a null point. But in some cases, us running a virtual machine could highlight that somebody's trying to conduct some type of analysis on us. And at the core, we can get execution of our payload, our stager, either through somebody opening an executable or non-executable file, could be some web link, could be just based upon a number of conditions, i.e. this time frame has happened, now execute, or when a particular user logs on, now execute. But we have the ability to really hard code that in and have some granularity into how and why it may execute. And not every environment is going to be the same. Now, some people will look to follow some type of methodology as far as trying to terminate this. Who's heard of cyber kill chain? Right? Okay, cool. This is a framework, much like a few other ones, but when we look at this, it's broken down into reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation. You kind of see it there. Lockheed Martin developed this back in 2011, and it's not a bad framework. I'm not going to say which one is better than the next, but as long as you're following some framework with some type of methodology, that's great. Now, it's linear, so we're going to go one stage after the other, and really the idea is to, if you're defending, is to get ahead in which this may take place. So we know somebody's going to do reconnaissance and they're going to work their way down. If you start to see something like reconnaissance or maybe weaponization, if you're in a place in which you can see it happening, then you may want to jump down one or two and figure out how you can stop them as they come on. You don't want to follow somebody down that same path that they're going to go, because inevitably you're not going to be able to catch up with them. But when we break this down a little bit, we look at reconnaissance from the perspective of somebody just trying to gain an understanding of our organization. That could be as simple as to what's published about us from an open source perspective online, things that could be found out against us. In some respect, if you're in this space, the spouse, significant other, parents, cousins, typically those are almost weakest links, because you could do everything in your power to lock down some of your social media and everything else, but some of your friends and family may not believe in that same thought process, so people can leverage those type of people to kind of gain some information about you as well. And then if we're totally, from an organization perspective, not visible online, it kind of makes it a little bit difficult for people to understand the product or e-commerce in which we're trying to sell or use. So from a weaponization perspective, after we've gained enough knowledge from the reconnaissance perspective, then we're going to look to craft or even in some cases develop vulnerabilities against that organization. Whether it be a 0 day, again, maybe that's not the space you run in, but I tell you 0 days are almost equivalent to end days in my opinion, right? Because how often are people going to run out the next day and update their machines? Some organizations, maybe yes, but there's still some organizations running XP. Heck, I went to an organization that had server 2000 still running on our infrastructure, and let them tell it was a vital piece and still is a vital piece. From that perspective, we go down into the delivery aspect, and now we're trying to figure out how we can actually get it on the machine. So we've done some reconnaissance, we've done some weaponization as far as our payload, our initial payload. Now we just got to get it actually to the machine itself. And then that kind of leads into the exploitation itself. And then from there, we're trying to install something. Now, from the perspective of our stager, this is where we start to come in. We're trying to get our stager on the machine. We're trying to put it in such a place in which it's not really installed, but it's definitely there, so we can be called upon. Once we have that executing, then we actually are communicating with our C2 server or servers. From there, we get to the point of going after whatever our objectives are. But really the key piece that we're going to focus on is really these two things, the installation, command, and control. That is really the basis for this talk, right? We've already assumed you've done some reconnaissance, weaponization, you've got it on the system, and now you're at a point where you're actually just trying to get it installed so you can reach back out to your C2 server. A way in which one could do that is kind of like so. They would take the data, they would convert it to bytes, then base 64 it, and then store it. That's one way. Now, you could do this in reverse order. You could do one of them, all of them, none of them, it doesn't matter, right? Like there's no wrong way to eresis, there's really no wrong way to do this unless the defender has some type of device that's gonna highlight it. But this is not a one-size-fits-all thought process, but this is definitely a way. Now we've already highlighted, we're talking about this from a post-exploitation perspective. You're already on the machine, cool. We need to figure out the state of it, or maybe the coast isn't clear for us to lay down some type of binary. So from that perspective, we are gonna take a fileless approach. Again, our stager is gonna be nothing but some actual code that's gonna run out and get something else for us. And the good thing about it is, it's there when we need it. So we don't have to keep going in there and laying it back down. So for this presentation, I'm going to use the what's shown before us. So I'm going to utilize some PowerShell here. I'm going to reach out to a C2 server that I'm going to say is 192.168.0.100. Right now I have it running over HTTP. We could do HTTPS. We can do some mangling as well, but for a simplistic perspective, that's what we're doing. Now the next line, I'm actually converting it to bytes, and then the third line, I'm gonna switch it to base 64. And I'm gonna spit that base 64 out to the screen. My C2 server, I'm gonna call back on quad 4s, and then my payload is gonna be a stager.ps1. I could just name it S or A, right? This is the good thing about this, because ultimately, this base 64 encoded string is what's going to be on the system. Somebody decodes that. What do I lose? I lose that URL, be it an IP address, domain, I lose that port, and I lose whatever that file name is. Now, stager.ps1 could insinuate to a person that this is a PowerShell script, could insinuate that it is a stager, so if we name it something like A, when the defender, when I'm looking at it, I don't know what it is. What is this A? I don't know, it's whatever's hosted there at the time. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, it could be some text that changes your screen blue. At 10 o'clock in the morning, that same file could change your text red. So the good thing about it is it's very agile in the sense of what we can do with it, right? We're just hosting whatever we need at the time and the place. All right, so the first one we're gonna actually use is Active Directory. Active Directory is a great enterprise service. It's gonna provide some authentication and authorization across an enterprise. If you're in a Windows environment, especially a domain environment, you're definitely gonna have Active Directory. The objects in there are usually arrayed in the sense of users, computers, there's some groups, but largely they're separated into organizational units for a simplistic perspective. Now, the database itself, well, we see where it's stored, system32, NTDS, NTDS, It's gonna be locked by default, but no harm, no foul for us. We're not trying to take it. When we look at Active Directory, we see something like so. Now, every environment is gonna be a little bit different. In this perspective, on the left-hand side, we have an East Coast OU, followed by a Boston OU, and then we have some OUs under it. Within the Boston OU, we see a number of users, some groups, we see some descriptions, all this good stuff. So this is great. This is typically how an admin would actually administer Active Directory. They would utilize this GUI. Some people look to utilize it through command line, whether it be PowerShell or some other third-party tool. From the PowerShell perspective, we can see how we're using getADUser, and we're able to get the same information from Active Directory. Now, this is good because you probably are in an organization, been to an organization in which there's people who haven't worked there in some time and their account is still there. Or there's some service account who's trying to log into a computer and they're failing that authentication on a day-to-day basis, right? Maybe they had a service account set up to perform some service and the machine no longer exists, or the password changed, or what have you. The point here is that this is a gold mine for us. So when we look at one individual object, we'll see something like the above here. And then from a PowerShell perspective, we're seeing some of that same data. The interesting thing about Active Directory is that there's roughly 50 properties for us to actually use. Some of them have size limitations and we're cognizant of that, but the good thing about it is by default, domain users can read Active Directory. That's good. Seems like I just need to get some code in there, and then no matter what machine I'm trying to have pull down my second part of my code, they'll be able to read that property and then go out and execute. Okay, awesome. Now, from the perspective of what that really looks like, we can utilize so. Now, up front when I was talking about my stager, my base64 code will always be in encoded text for the context of this brief. So I'm going to utilize one of 3 properties that isn't shown by default, So if I were to go into the GUI aspect of Active Directory, I wouldn't be able to see employee ID, employee number, or division, except for within Attribute Editor. There's no other place that is shown right there by default. Would an admin cut that on? Maybe, right? But again, this is all about me knowing my environment. I say 9 times out of 10, they wouldn't. So I have the ability where I'm going to call upon the user. In this case, I'm going to do Nick Shank, and then I'm going to set that AD user's division property with whatever that base64 code is. Again, if they went into Attribute Editor, they would be able to see it. Now, I could get a little more stealthy in this, and I could add an actual property that looks like it makes sense with division and push that down, but from a simplistic perspective, it's there. Now, when I call upon it from the command line, we see it as below. Now, again, I need somebody to go into Attribute Editor to actually look at that. The fact is, I'd rather take my chances with this because I don't believe an admin's going to go in there and do it, nor would it stand out to a point in which they did, would it be something that causes concern for them. The next one is the registry. Now, that's my favorite, actually, because I was up at Microsoft in Charlotte, actually, like 2 weeks ago, and I was having this conversation about the registry, and there's so many keys, there's so many values, in the registry that I was willing to make a bet, a 50-cent bet, that there's no admin in the world who can tell you about every key, every value in a Windows machine, right? There's just so much stuff. And with that plethora of data that's there, that seems like a good place for somebody to stage their code. Now, in my example, I'm gonna do it 1 layer deep, but largely speaking, we wanna go several layers deep. So the registry is really formed like so. We have our registry files on disk, and then as we go through a process, either the Windows system itself booting up or a user logging in, those hives on disk get loaded into memory, and then they become our actual HKLM or HKCU, the things that we're accustomed to seeing in the registry while we're logged on. While a person is logged on, those things are actually locked and they're not editable by a user. The things that get loaded and where they sit on disk are as follows. So we have SAM, Security Software System Default. Those all get loaded into HKLM or HK users. And then we have the NT-user.dat and then the actual user class.dat. Those two sit in the user's profile and they get loaded into current user. If I was logged on and we just did switch user, rather than my NT-user.dat getting unloaded, I would then have my user hive moved over to HK users. From the perspective of the registry though, again, I'm 1 layer deep, so I'm HKLM software, and I created a value called updater32, because frankly speaking, if we add 32 or 64 onto the majority of everything in Windows, most people would look at it and be like, oh, okay, that looks legit, right? And then we've added our code here. Again, from a PowerShell perspective, I'm just adding a new item and I see it there. Now, if I get to the point where maybe this is too loud, then again, I would put in some padding to push it off the screen, make it into where a user would actually have to double click and open it. And with my padding, I would have some other verbiage up front. 1 layer deep right now. If we go like 4 or 5 layers deep, it would be tough for an admin to be able to see it. Near the end, we'll talk about some mitigation techniques though. All right, then we have event logs. Now, the event logs are very interesting. From a GUI perspective, we have event viewer. These essentially provide some form of notification, detailed notification of things happening on the system. While the event log provides a lot of information out the box, a number of good entries need to be enabled using auditing. And that's not really what we're here to talk about. What we're looking to do is take advantage of it. The fact is, good places for our code will be really anywhere that's cumbersome with a lot of data that an admin can overlook. And the good thing here is this is a good place. So the bad thing about it is typically these things are circular, so as events pile up, the code that we have in there could be overwritten. To really combat this, we'll look at making our own. But when we talk about there's a lot of logs in here, we're talking to the tune of 386-ish just off of a server 2016 machine that I was on at the time. All right, so I feel like that's a good place for us to be. Particularly speaking, if we can name it in such a way, adding 32 or 64 or something on it, in which could be bypassed by an admin. So I talked about making our own event logs, and the reason for that is because if we look to put our stuff in application or the firewall log or one of these other logs, again, our stuff may be overwritten and essentially put off the system. When we put our stuff in our own custom log and then wrap some other stuff around it to make it look legit, we stand a chance of living in the event logs a lot longer. So what we'll do is we'll create a new event log. I'm going to call it Windows Updater, and I'm going to create a source. The source is nothing more than, you'll see the top of the event log here where it says Updater 64. It's the identifier for that actual log itself. So we'll write out to the event log our encoded message. So now I have my base 64 sitting there. I can go back at another time and just make sure it's there. And from there, I have the ability to read that file, call upon the message field, and then pipe it to something that's going to execute it. Again, this contains my stager. That stager was nothing more than that URL wrapped in system.net.web client. No harm, no foul if this gets found. I lose an IP address, maybe a domain. I lose essentially that, right? In this case, they see stager.ps1, but they don't have access to that file. They just see what I would be going out to get. Now, they could get a little, vicarious and go out there and try to authenticate to my server. We're not really talking about how we're gonna stop that, which we would be able to. We're just more or less identifying where we can store this stuff so we can go back and get stuff later on. We also have group policy. Group policy is a little iffy, but when we look at group policy itself, that's going to be the hierarchical infrastructure that's going to be used to implement specific things, whether it's program installation, settings, or just really any other configuration that we can think of. From an enterprise perspective, we have group policy management. From a local system perspective, we have the actual loop group policy itself. Doesn't really matter which one we're going to use, we have the ability to store code there. From a management perspective, we're going to utilize the description field. While there's a number of editable things within group policy that we can use, the last thing we want to do is put our code in something that has some adverse action on the box. So we'll look to put it in the actual comment field. The way we'll do that, we'll call upon our default domain policy, because I know that's going to get implemented everywhere. And then we're going to store our encoded text in description. Now, when we do that, I see it just at the bottom there under comment. Normally I wouldn't care as much, but this is one of those things that I feel like an admin would be in group policy, clicking around, and it would stand out. So I'm not too keen about leaving that there. What I looked to do following this was to add in 7 new lines. So in PowerShell, we're just adding in new lines. And then I want to put my encoded text. So I'll look to see what that does for me. And lo and behold, that actually pushes that code down. Okay, I'm on to something. 7 new lines pushed it down. So now I'll look to do that a little bit more. And in this case, ended up doing 20. When I do that, based upon the screen, there's no size that the user can make it in which they'd be able to see that. However, when I go look at it from a PowerShell perspective and call upon it, and in this case, I have a variable called retrieve, I see that blank space, essentially those 20 new lines, and then I see my code. This is a good chance that I'm willing to take at the moment, not knowing who the admin is, nor do I know how they actually do their job. But I know one thing, most admins are not going to be using the command line to administer group policy. They're going to be in group policy management or the local group policy window itself, and they won't be able to see that to the screen. And then us actually executing that is nothing more than calling upon it and passing it to some type of execution engine. And I'll actually demo doing one of these at the end. Then we have alternate data streams. Now, what's interesting about that is, if you've been in this space for a while, you may be saying, well, alternate data streams isn't new. I recognize that, but it still works, right? So as long as it works, we're still gonna use it. Now, what may be new is that we're gonna put some malicious code in there. People hiding data in there, yeah, that's been a thing. But when we look at alternate data streams, definitely something that's part of NTFS file system, was made as a cross-compatibility for Mac OS, and by default has a stream of $ data. But alternate data streams are also used by Internet Explorer, depending on if you have your internet zone set up. Have you ever downloaded something, tried to execute it, and it tells you, hey, this came from the internet, you shouldn't trust it, or what have you? It's like, well, how do you know that? Well, there's an alternate data stream associated with it called Zone Identifier, and it has a tag in there telling you that the file came from the internet. We can easily remove it. We can easily add some stuff to it. That's interesting. So in this case, we'll look to make our own so we can actually get around it. Now, as we look at this, I'm going to get the metadata associated with this item, and it's called my file. All I did was make a blank file or an empty file, and I see the length is 0. I'm gonna write some green eggs and ham type stuff to a alternate data stream that I call my stream. When I look at it, it's gonna be 3599 bytes, but again, the size of the original file, the host file itself, isn't altered. So that's cool. Now I need to figure out the place to put it in which this thing doesn't get overwritten or messed with. Well, on a local machine, I think this is a good place, right? Etsy host. Definitely gonna be there. You're not gonna touch it. Feel pretty confident about this. Now, the environment will dictate where is a good place, but SE host seems good for me. So I'm going to take that file that's already there, I'm going to add content to it, and the content that I'm going to add is a alternate data stream called secret stream. The thing I'm going to fill with it is encoded text. So for me to actually see this, I'm going to need either PowerShell or some other tool to be able to see that alternate data stream. In this case, at the bottom, I'm going to go and read that, and I see my code. Again, this is nothing more than a stager. All right. Then we have environment variables. All right, these things are dynamic in our environment, and they're really based upon the system itself. So when we had up here a while ago, that was essentially a environment variable insinuating where our Windows directory was on that machine. There's a number of them there, but it makes it to where you don't have to hard code stuff in. Some people do the baseline installation when it comes to Windows. Other people install Windows on, let's say, their D drive. So environment variables help us with that. There's two types. There's going to be user specific, and then there's going to be system ones. System ones are global in nature. They're going to persist past reboots. So this seems like an awesome place for us to put things in so we can go back and grab them later on. The way we'll do that is like so. We'll create a new environment variable. I'm going to call it common program W64. Why? Because there's already a common program W there. Okay, so I put 64 next to it. Most people will say it's legit and keep going about their business. So we'll store it in our user run space first, and then the second line is us doing it from a system-wide perspective. The reason why we're going to put in our user space first is because when we add this system-wide one, it doesn't kick in or take effect until we reboot the box. So I don't want to affect whatever system I'm on, but I do want to be able to get after the task I'm using right now. So when we do this, we get something like so. We have it being written to the registry. We have it being written to the actual environment drive within PowerShell. And when we went and looked at our system variables, like right-clicking computer, go on properties, we see it there. Now, I'm not concerned with people looking at it from PowerShell. That's a one-off skill or one-off thing that people would actually use. I'm not necessarily worried about people looking at it from the registry. I don't see admins doing that too often. If anything, an admin may look there, if anything. So we'll look to push that off some. And the way we'll look to do that is kind of like what we did before with some padding. Instead of doing new lines, we'll just add some padding up front. In this case, I think it was like 7 or 8 spaces that we added in there. We'll do it a little bit more, and now we've totally pushed it off the screen. Again, if I was concerned about somebody double clicking it, they would be able to see it. But if I'm concerned about that, I can add some text in there. Maybe I put C Windows something, right? And then a number of padded characters just to push the rest of it off the screen. And then when we call upon this key, we can get rid of the fake text and the padding and then execute it. But from this perspective, we have the ability to actually store this on our system. And the full code looks like so. So that very first line, we have a space, and then we're going to pad it with 160 of them, and then we're going to add in our encoded text. And then we're just continuing on like we created it before. All right, and then we have WMI in SIM, so Windows Management Instrumentation, and then Common Information Model. WMI was Microsoft's response to WBIM. All right, so WBIM is going to be the whole web-based enterprise management aspect, which was really a initiative to get after how do we share information amongst the system and a number of systems. So Microsoft's implementation of that is WMI. WMI has been around for a long time. We're talking like roughly 1990s, and it was made available within PowerShell up until version 2. With version 3, Microsoft has done away with that, and then they've come out with the Common Information Model. Right? So when we start talking about a modern version of Windows, modern version of PowerShells, that's the method in which they're going forth with. WMI or a SIM, it utilizes a number of classes and namespaces. Largely, these things are way too large for an admin to be able to understand, but nonetheless, we'll dive a little bit deep into it. These namespaces are organizations of classes themselves. So let's say we had Win32 process, for example. That allows us to get running processes off of a machine. And then that itself as a class would fall under some type of namespace. Maybe that namespace would have processes, services, the ability to read environment variables, or a number of other things. So namespaces are essentially buckets, and then the classes themselves actually allow us to get the information. The classes, though, they have properties and methods. So when we look at properties, those are going to be essentially attributes about something. And then when we look at methods, those are going to be actions that we can take. So this is all kind of interesting because we can utilize WMI and really SIM to get after our hard task of finding a place to store our code. And we're going to do that outside of what they already have. We're going to make our own. Because if we make our own, there's no signature for it. But depending on our machine, the number of these classes kind of, they sway in a sense of number. On the machine that I was on, I think this was a Windows 10 I did this on, I had roughly 10,000 classes, roughly 10,000, right? That's huge. These classes are made available based upon what type of software we have installed on the machine, but let's be real, 10,000, like that's gonna be difficult for a admin to track, so they're gonna wanna get after it another way. And the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna walk through it. So, I got a machine here. See if I can log on with one hand. Okay, cool. So I have a website that is being hosted by Powershell. It's nothing more than a simple web server. So if you're used to Python and you've heard of simple HTTP server, the same thing in PowerShell, and it's literally roughly 18 lines. So, oh, you don't see any of this. Okay, now you see it, cool. So we're talking roughly 18 lines makes up this web shell. The interesting about this, not web shell, this website is it serves up everything that's on my actual desktop. So we can come in here, and from a command line perspective, we'll just see if we can interact with the website, and we can. So the very thing that we called upon, stager.ps1, if you look at the third line under what's being returned, it has a com object, which is going to spit out a like a text form, if you will, right? Like a pop-up box. In this case, it's just a pop-up box, but you could really host whatever you want, right? It could be another piece of code that is called upon another site to download something. The good thing about how we're doing is that script that we're downloading, stager.ps1, never touches this system. The contents of it are downloaded and stored in memory, right, for the context in which this process is running in. So depending on what type of AV we may have, this stands a high chance of not being caught, right? Because I would expect my AV to catch anything that I put on my disk malicious, but anything not, maybe not so much. So I'm going to create a new class called Win32Defend64. It does not exist. And the way we do that is we're going to create a new object, and then we're going to actually save it. Cool. So I have a new class that I'm going to call Win32Defend64. From there, I'm going to create a new property. And as you recall, the properties were nothing more than attributes. So I'm going to call this property my property. I'll store in there just a string, and it's going to be just a simple test to see if I can actually write that to it. I'll go back and verify that it's there, and we can see down below the second line there, it says value. This is just a test to see if data can be stored. Okay, awesome. So data can be stored. I'm going to go back through, and take my stager string, and now I'm going to start the process of converting it to base 64 so I can save it. But as such, I just have my string. Cool. So then we'll convert it to bytes, we'll convert it to base 64, and then we'll verify that it's there. Cool. And this is what I'm storing on disk. So very minimal. If we see that this amount of characters is what's rendered with just that string, imagine if we were trying to put a binary. Imagine if that binary cost us some money, right? Maybe it was through man hours of development, maybe we purchased it from some other type of organization, but nonetheless, let's think about the costs associated with it. So I'm gonna create another property, I'll call it path, and then I'll store in there my actual base 64 code. And then when I go back to actually look at it, I see my base 64 code, and I also see that string up top that we called upon earlier. So now it's in there. I can restart the box, I can go about my merry business, I can come back a month later, and I can utilize this code that's here. So long as this box doesn't get reformatted or go offline, I have it there for as long as I need it. Now, when it's time for me to actually run it, I can call upon it like so, verifying it's there, and then we can actually execute it. In this case, it's just a pop-up box. But again, maybe it's a next stage downloader where it goes out to my site, and instead of pulling back this little pop-up box, it pulls down a binary. Maybe I tell it to survey the system, telling me, what users logged on, what's the architecture, what's the health and status as far as how often they updated. Maybe I tell it to execute a keylogger for a period of time and then bring that information back. Really, the opportunities, the things that we can do are endless. And I don't even have to change the name of this. So right now it's stager.ps1, but on my C2 server, I can just open that up, put some other stuff in there, and then the next time it comes to reach back and grab it, it executes that. So it's very dynamic and modular from that perspective. Now, I'm not the first person to think about stagers, right? So as we look at 1971 with the creeper malware to where we're at now, there's a lot of people in between, more so in the last 10 years that really have jumped on this. And we see a number of threat sets that are starting to use multi-stage or stage malware, and from my perspective, I think it's more common than what we believe, right? But we see people using proxies, right, in order to retrieve additional payloads. Why? Because the malware which they want to lay on that system, too costly for them to go out there and just do it from the beginning. We have them utilizing that payload or really that stager to understand the machine. We see that's where backspace does. Again, why would I take time to install or lay down something that we've spent a lot of time and money on just to have it sucked up by some type of antivirus? And then we see stuff like Muddy Water, right? Muddy Water at the bottom, it utilizes it so they can download enumeration scripts to better understand the machine before it goes on. Now, nothing in life comes without some good and bad. In this case, we have some pros. Very lightweight. You see that was essentially a one-liner of sorts. I can wrap that whole delivery perspective up on my machine, the attacker machine, and then really all I'm putting on target is actual base 64 itself. Very low equity. What do I lose if that gets caught? Nothing. It's modular, so I can change that code at any time, and then we can host it wherever we want. Now, some of the cons in this is, depending on the visibility of that infrastructure, it could be very visible that we're going out and downloading stuff. Also, it may spike or really present to somebody that we're doing something nefarious if they're unfamiliar with the sites in which we're going to download it from. And then if our stager becomes blocked, or really our C2 server becomes blocked at any time, then we kind of lose visibility and the ability to affect anything on there. So some mitigation techniques. Well, least privilege. You heard Dave talk about segmentation and isolation. Absolutely. Application whitelisting. Definitely. difficult to actually do, time intensive, but man, I tell you, probably provides the most bang for buck as far as reward. And then detection. You can't detect what you don't have. So if you're not logging, you're already losing. And then from a proactive perspective, go out there and do some threat hunting and some analysis. Well, we're not infiltrated, I don't see anything. Well, that's because you're not looking hard enough, or the people who's in your network are very quiet. But at the end of the day, there's a couple ways to get around it. Now, as I start to wrap up here, right, you see me use PowerShell very heavily. Well, I run 2 PowerShell training sites. One is called Under the Wire. Under the Wire has seen about 70,000 people since 2015, roughly players from 78 of the 193-ish countries. And essentially, Under the Wire allows you to SSH into a Windows environment. We'll present you with a task, and then whatever the answer is to that task becomes the password to the next user. And you're essentially going about the game in that manner. It is designed to give people access to a PowerShell, interactive PowerShell environment, and to provide training. It's all free, right? And it's linear in nature, and we're talking about roughly 75 challenges. Now, if that's not difficult enough for you, as we talk about the whole purple team, blue team, red team, well then we have Posh Hunter. Posh Hunter is roughly 90 challenges. That allows you to, from a situation, scenario-based perspective, go through and utilize PowerShell to answer particular questions. 1 minute you're some blue team guy in a SOC, the next minute you're some red team guy on some engagement. But nonetheless, all you have is PowerShell. You'll get to see how people are using it from a day-to-day perspective. You'll get to gain more familiarity with it and take it back to your environment, which is what I think anybody and everybody would like to have. So with that, that brings us to the end. I'll pause for any questions. There's some information about me if you want to keep in touch or any of that type of stuff. This presentation is at that site if you're interested. All right, awesome, thank you.